colleagues here at WGSI in Caribbean Studies and in History. I look forward to our conversation, and I encourage you all to get and read this book as soon as you're able. In the time I have today, I want to briefly sketch what I took to be the stakes, central arguments, and critical interventions of Virgin Capital before asking Dr. Navarro to read a selection from the text and share some of her own insights. Then I will follow up with a couple of my own questions, and hopefully we can open it up to the audience and have a really rich discussion. So Virgin Capital does so much important theoretical, conceptual, and methodological work, but I want to start, perhaps for those who haven't read it, with what the book does so well in more general terms. So the book charts the rise in the USVI of the Economic Development Commission, or EDC, as a new mode of development. It traces the shifting paradigms of development from schemes rooted in industrial manufacture or export to capital investment in offshore banking and financial services. In the book's chapters, Navarro tracks the gendered and racial capitalist implications of this shift in developmental priorities and what it meant for Crucians on the ground. These are critical insights and it's critical work building upon the work of many scholars, including Peter James Hudson, who insists that we must pay attention to the ways in which finance capital, not only extractive industries like mining and foreign agricultural conglomerates, undermine Caribbean sovereignty and impose and restructure new labor, racial, and gender hierarchies. So although the white men heads of financial management companies who arrive in St. Croix did not see themselves as colonists, they explicitly invoke the USVI's status as an American territory in order to reassure prospective investors of the stability and soundness of their investment. What was supposed to comfort investors was the very colonial relation that Crucians feared and that they were told would not be replicated. And although these firms were required as part of the EDC arrangement to hire locals as part of those conditions, Navarro shows the way in which this was not at all egalitarian. And in fact, it could reinforce existing inequities and create new ones. Indeed, the critique of the program by Crucians themselves was captured in the sentiment that slave days are over, which Navarro writes, quote, names the continuities between this program, the EDC, and exploitative historical processes in the region. Crucian's critique of finance, capital, and foreign investment and the development of investment housing that it required is seen by these white men bankers as irrational fear or a persistent anti-modernism or even a refusal to join the future. But what Navarro shows so well is that this mutual unintelligibility is underwritten by Crucian's historical experience of slavery, colonialism, and racial violence. Navarro argues, quote, neoliberal initiatives that advocate the freeing of markets and purport to mark the way to toward greater global integration build upon and often lead to the entrenchment of existing processes of racialized and gendered inequality. In many formerly peripheral spaces, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, this relationship to neoliberalism is conditioned by long and violent histories of slavery and colonialism that make the ostensibly novel circulations of European and American capital and the racialized hierarchies they engender hauntingly familiar, end quote. Navarro refers to this complex, non-linear understanding of history and how it informs local politics and postures towards neoliberalism as spectral time, a concept that beautifully draws upon and elaborates the work of scholars of the Caribbean, such as Jackie Alexander, Antonio Benitez Rojo, Sidney Mintz, Mimi Scheller, and Aisha Khan, among others. As a historian, what interested me about the concept of spectral time is the way in which it disrupts the linearity of time that's supposedly neutral and universal, while it also accounts for these continuities of the past in the present. And in disrupting linear time in this way, by showing how different actors inhabit different time spaces, perhaps as a complement to David Scott's notion of a problem space, we can see what emerges as a critique of capitalism in Slave Days Over. That can also be understood as an assertion of ontological wholeness. To preserve Black being from the ravages of capitalism, colonialism, slavery, and neoliberalism is a fundamental aspect of the Black radical tradition. So in addition to doing some important work here on racial capitalism, I also see the kind of edges of the Black radical tradition here as well. A kind of fugitivity that must, in order to preserve itself, recognize that slave days are in fact not over, and to be alert to the ways in which they can shapeshift and reappear under other guises. To me, by narrating the misreading of Crucians by white financiers, Navarro elucidates not only the changing forms of racial capitalism, but also the responses and the responsive reflexes of the Black radical tradition in the 21st century. And this is, she also says, not without its contradictions, and she deftly shows how Crucians had a range of responses to financialized development and its incursions in St. Croix. In chapter 6, which was really beautiful to me, Easy Money and Respectable Girls, Gender Ideology and Neoliberal Development, we see how Black women working in the EDC sector had to navigate respectability and only engage in activities that were central to kind of middle-class social reproduction. Through her deep and careful ethnographic work, Navarro finds the existence of the, quote, EDC girl. These women, usually selected from St. Croix's middle and upper classes, are nevertheless caught between the fantasy of a high salary and glamorous, conspicuous consumption and the difficult reality of the social stigma of working in a sector that's broadly perceived to be parasitic and neocolonial. So EDC girls also often face pressure and the pressure and expectation to grant loans to friends and family and to spend their supposedly ostentatious wealth that's truly non-existent. This chapter updates and contributes to histories of feminized labor in the Caribbean. Navarro shows that despite the supposed revolutionary modernity of finance capitalism vis-a-vis industrial capitalism, both forms and the monocrop agricultural capitalism of slavery that preceded those two, all of them rely on Black women as crucial sources of labor and profit. Finance capital, with its claims to modernity and severing the colonial past and offering Crucians opportunities, still positions Black women in ways that render their work invisible while maintaining an explicit expectation of their visible feminine respectability. Her analysis of middle-class Caribbean women's relationship to neoliberalism is wonderfully nuanced, and she argues, quote, these women nimbly navigate these expectations and actively participate in the crafting of new social and economic realities. Finally, the book leaves us with crucial questions about the meaning of development in our own moment, and ultimately how Caribbean people might revise old and discover new strategies for traversing and hopefully transcending capitalist relations. As I said earlier, I have so many questions that came out of reading this wonderful text, and I have so many questions for Dr. Navarro, but I will leave it at that for now and let her treat us to a selection from the book, and then we'll open it up for questions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I'm so appreciative of your rich engagement and your really valuable comments. Before I read, I'll just react to a few things that you've said. The first of which is that in writing this book, I started to see myself as more of a translator than anything else, because of the kind of misapprehension that you pointed to, Shauna. Because in doing the work, it was very clear to me that the Crucians with whom I was working in this kind of interesting methodology, which we can maybe talk about later, but the folks I was talking to and sort of hanging around with as my informants, they were adamantly against the EDC program as an exploitative extension of these previous moments of racial capitalism. You know, they said slave days over, so they named it in relation to slavery, but it was really seen as the most recent iteration of the ongoing project of Black dispossession, right, in the wake of wealthy white people increasing their wealth by circuiting through the region. And so they saw it as an old story that kind of this was a flashpoint in that story. So that was one set of conversations. And then when I would go into these EDC offices or meet with these beneficiaries, they were baffled, right? They saw themselves and were encouraged, I should say, by local government officials to see themselves as the savior of this long struggling economy. So the particularities of St. Croix's economic history are such that it was during the plantation agriculture period the most lucrative of the 3 US Virgin Islands. And with the decline of plantation agriculture moving into industrial development, and now we have this kind of moment of finance capital in other places in the region, in Barbados, informatics, data entry, but the kind of emphasis on virtuality, the kind of lighter development, it has been seen and presented as something that would be uniformly beneficial to these host societies, and yet, right? So they're encouraged, come down, relocate your companies to the American territory. Much as you pointed out, Shauna, much is made of the sort of stability of the U.S. flag. Your capital will be safe. Our banks are not going to get nationalized. Nothing will sort of be lost, right? You have this sort of the confidence in U.S. empire, right? So they're encouraged to see themselves this way. How confusing then when you get on the ground and you encounter this kind of resentment, frustration. You are seen as a sort of extension of the plantocracy. And so those two sides were really at odds, and there was a lot of misapprehension. There was a lot of accusatory language, right? It's sort of like, if we could just get these folks to see how this is good for them, if we could only give them the right data point, right? That there's a sort of magical key that was anticipated on the side of EDC beneficiaries that would unlock the sort of glory of this neoliberal development program. And so a lot of the work was really, and that's where Spectral Time came in. It was really me trying to sort of thread the needle between these two positions, between these two worldviews, really, about, the meaning, the intent, the operations of capitalism and racial capitalism. And more importantly, I would say the experience of being the space upon which racial capitalism is acting, right? What does it mean to sort of every day when you're driving to work or walking to work, as is the case in the Virgin Islands, walk past the ruins of plantations, right? That you're seeing this, that you're living with this. I write briefly about, I worked in one EDC office of this outfit called Stanford Financial, which was in downtown Christiansted, one of the kind of main hubs of business and shopping. And a few hundred yards away is one of the forts, one of the Danish forts. And during my time there, they unearthed one of the whipping posts that had been used during slavery, right? So the kind of dysphoria that's caused, right, by trying to say that there's a radical break with what has happened before, when Crucians are seeing very clearly that, in fact, this new opportunity that's being presented to them very directly builds on these pre-existing hierarchies of things like class and color, surely, but shade, right? When we think about the role of pigmentocracy across the Caribbean, mobility, linguistic facility, right? So does one have a noticeable Crucian accent, less noticeable? But there are all these kinds of both hard and soft skills, as the EDC folks would say, that come to bear when folks are thinking about what is the right employee for this company, was the right face of this company. So that's all to say that that's how Spectral Time comes into it, that I'm trying to sort of find the language, building on this rich scholarship that you, and thank you for that, pointed to. There's folks like Deborah Thomas as well. You talked about Jackie Alexander and the palimpsestic time, but we're all sort of trying to think about, many of us who work in the Caribbean, well, we know it's not linear. The experience of time is certainly not linear, but how do we get at the complexity of it? And for me, I had to find something that really prioritized and privileged the fear, because that's what it was. There was a kind of deep anxiety about, well, what is this now? Like, what is this? We have to be vigilant. And you talked about the shape shifting, right? And I think that that's really exactly right, that the theoreticians that were my informants, they had a really sharp eye and a keen analysis to the kind of shape-shifting moment that this was in racial capitalism. And they were really very clear with themselves, with me, and with the interlocutors who were beneficiaries of the EDC program, that this was part of the same long project, right? Whether these folks wanted to admit it or not. So I really saw it as a translation project, and that's how Spectral Time came in, to try to make sense of this worldview, that it wasn't madness or anti-modernism or like a misapprehension, but it really was a sort of long and deep engagement with what had happened in this space and spaces around the Virgin Islands for a long time. So I very much appreciate your comments, and I'm just going to read briefly from the introduction, which lays out a bit about what the project is and what I see as some of the major stakes of it, sort of how it came to be and who some of the major players are. At the outset of my field work, the question of methodology loomed large in my mind. My central concern was how to get at the complexity of the Economic Development Commission EDC program on St. Croix. In 2007, everywhere I went on the island, this tax holiday program seemed to be all anyone could talk about. There was excitement and optimism around St. Croix's economic future, but there was just as much suspicion and fear surrounding the program and the mainland Americans it had brought to this US territory. How would I construct a methodology that would bring together both the anxiety and anticipation of the EDC program? Would I conduct focus groups, engage in the deep hanging out offered by Clifford Geertz? As these questions swirled in my mind, I dedicated myself to perfunctory tasks. Checking the mail was ideal because it afforded me an opportunity to interact with people and vitally offered the illusion that I was busy, a person with somewhere to be and something to do when I was decidedly not. As I walked into the post office one Wednesday afternoon and stood in line to buy stamps, I heard shouting. Although yelling was not in itself unusual, as customers often loudly grumbled about the long wait time or inefficient service, this was different. This was an argument, a shouting match really, between two customers, a middle-aged white woman and a Black man from St. Kitts in his 60s. They were debating the skyrocketing cost of real estate and property taxes on St. Croix. The woman, Karen, insisted that these increases were the fault of the EDC program in general and, quote, that Stanford man in particular. Alan Stanford was a billionaire who had recently relocated his considerable business operations to St. Croix. This is after being ousted by Antigua, and had been in the process of purchasing large tracts of land across the island since his arrival. The man with whom Karen was arguing, however, insisted that these developments were the fault of unmotivated locals, arguing, quote, is we. If we don't buy, we can't get vex. In this debate, Karen was squarely in the camp of St. Croix residents who were critical of this program and its wealthy beneficiaries. Her interlocutor, however, articulated a competing position, that Virgin Islanders were not merely victims of global capital and its handlers, but rather that they had a part to play in negotiating the terms of its impact on the island. After witnessing this exchange, I approached Karen outside of the post office and asked to talk with her about her views on the program. As we walked to a nearby cafe to escape the scorching summer heat, she told me that having lived in the Virgin Islands for over 20 years, she was concerned about the rising cost of land on St. Croix, in part as a result of the astronomical sums being paid by wealthy white families brought to the island by the EDC program. And she told me about her plans to organize what she called a March for Peace, that she hoped would diffuse what she saw as increasing racial tensions on the island as a result of the EDC. This march, she felt, was needed as the arrival of wealthy white Americans on the island had reinvigorated longstanding anxieties related to race, wealth, and belonging. Thanks. So I think I will stop there with my reading so that we have time to have a conversation. And I'm so looking forward to talk with you, Shauna, and also members of the audience.
Thank you so much, Tami. And thank you for answering that question. You predicted a question I had about spectral time and answered it really nicely. But I'm also happy to return to it because I think there's so much there. And thank you for that reading from the introduction. Part of what you do so well is show the kinds of multiple navigations or negotiations that people did around this EDC program, and that it wasn't kind of uniform or universal responses to it. And that's just what that section in the introduction made me think of. But I have a slightly different question from another place in the text. In this first chapter, you really lay out your methods really well. You lay out your methods and positionality, and the interplay between those two things very clearly in the book. How does and did your own history and background shape your methodological approach? And which texts or scholars were some of your models? Like, who did you model your kind of methodological approach on? Another question I'll ask, and then maybe see if there are any others from the audience. What was it like to be conducting field research during the financial crisis? You interned at Stanford Capital before it crashed and burned. Did that experience change what you thought about the power or durability of finance capitalism or of markets in general? How did it affect your findings? I'll stop at just two, but I can go on if need be.
No. Let's do these, and then if I miss, we'll circle back. This is wonderful, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for asking a question about my methodology. I was very mindful in writing this text that I wanted, as you saw in that little excerpt I just read, I wanted to be pretty transparent about my methodological practices and theories. I feel that quite often grad students, particularly in anthropology, are sort of sent out into the field, hopefully with some sort of methodology course under their belt, but it really becomes a question of, I'm here now, what do I do? Literally, what do I do every day, right? It's 10 a.m. on a Monday. Where do I go? Where's the office? And so I wanted to be upfront about some of the fear and some of the anxiety and confusion that kind of governed those early days until I sort of made my way. And one of the texts that was really, and I'll say more about this, that was really useful to me is rereading the work of John Jackson, who in one of his, I think it's in Real Black, he talks about creating an alter ego, and a sort of super anthropologist, which he calls Anthroman, somebody who doesn't have a fear of cold calling and just walk up to people and talk about his project and see if they will, talk with him or answer his questions. So I tried to embody some of that because, in the early days, it really is up to you to kind of carve your way. And in the chapter where I more explicitly deal with the methodology, I talk about some of the complexity that I experienced, given my own, at that time, deeper investments in objectivity. So I haven't mentioned to this audience yet that I'm also from St. Croix. And so a lot of the way that this project came into being is through long-term conversations that I had with people who up until that point had been my friends or neighbors or just sort of acquaintances, who then became formal informants when the sort of period of official field work began. But I really had to spend a lot of time trying to work through my own positionality and what I felt was permissible for me as an anthropologist. So how do I navigate between my anthropologist self and my self, who they know, right, as somebody who's been on vacation with them or just been on the phone with them or been a friend to them. And so I found myself kind of toggling between those two positions and wanting to make that kind of division as clear as possible for the people with whom I was speaking, because I felt it was in the interest of the project. So they would say things like, well, you know how they are, and you know how we are, right? And so a big element of the book is really troubling these binaries, which are in reality troubled and always shifting, right? They're very situational. And so them could easily be sort of wealthy white investors from the US, or it could be talking about this sort of Caribbean migrants who are known as down islanders, right? Who come for economic and have historically come for economic opportunity from places like Grenada or St. Lucia, right? And Akia Gore writes about this. So the them and the us, I had to really spend a lot of time kind of getting that right in my own head and thinking about how I was going to make that clear to my informants. And it was hard because I think for a lot of anthropologists, I hope this is changing now for grad students, but there's a real kind of emphasis on going somewhere pretty far afield, right? That a real project, a fundable project, a proper anthropological project involves, going on, learning a new language and sort of going somewhere pretty far afield. I have written about and elsewhere and published on some of the roots of anthropology and why I think that persists, the kind of notion of this white male ethnographer, with this sort of machete going into this uncharted territory with a translator. And I think that there's some of those underpinnings, we can still see the kind of trickling down in the way that discipline operates today. One of the things that I think comes out of that is, the ability to circumvent any kind of conversation with your informants after the fact, right? So they share this information with you, you dialogue, and you sort of go back, write something, and they either can't read it, don't have access to it, but it's not circulated among these communities. And I felt like it was important for me to work through all of that because this was my home space and it's a space that I knew these are people I cared about both within and outside of the project. And I wanted to sort of honor the fact that they had shared their life stories with me and their kind of takes on what was happening to both their island and their lives in this moment. So that was tricky. And some of the people that were really helpful to me in their work was Ronnie Hurston, this notion of this sort of native, which is a troubled category, but her sort of position as a native anthropologist, leaving after being trained by Franz Boas and going back to Florida to collect these folk tales and stories, and just really standing in that, right? That she is known today, I would say, more popularly as a novelist, but it was really her anthropological identity and writing that sort of made me think, okay, this has been done and importantly done, right? So that that kind of gave me the sense that this was a justifiable project and that I would be able to sort of do it, even with these doubts of, what is objectivity and what is the kind of authority that I am seeding here by being from this space. So John Jackson's work was great. Ronnie Hurston, Donna Ian Davis, and Krista Craven have an amazing volume on autoethnography. And again, thinking through, particularly for Black women ethnographers, how do we sort of course, as anthropologists, we have to do this sort of reflexivity, positionality statement, but really in a deep kind of dwelling way, thinking about how elements of our identity contribute to our presence in the field and the way that we are perceived by our informants and the way that we sort of process the data and the theories that we then present in our work. So there was a lot of work that I really sort of thought with. I also read a lot of Audre Lorde, with whom I opened the book. There's an epigraph from Audre Lorde at the start of the book, which was really useful to me. She spent her final years on St. Croix after her cancer diagnosis, doing amazing feminist work. And again, just standing on that and thinking about, okay, what are the ways that people have tried to sort of navigate these structures? If I'm taking spectral time seriously, that these are long-standing structures and hierarchies, how have people sort of made interventions in a previous moment? So I would say that those are some of the sort of main activists, poets, scholars that were central to my thinking. And the next question, and tell me if I missed a bit of what you asked, Shauna, but I have here that you said, what was it like to do this field work during the crash? And it's so funny because in the writing up of it, it seems very much like I was in the midst of all this chaos, that the world was crashing down around me. But that's funny. I think when we read about COVID in a decade or two, it will seem crazy that someone's writing something dated February 2020, and we know what's coming, but they are just living their life, right? And I was just living my life. I'm going into these EDC offices, I was talking with people, and it's really when I left, I mean, you saw the kind of beginnings of some of the beneficiaries being concerned about the grumblings in the real estate market. But it's really when I concluded formal fieldwork and I went back to the mainland to begin writing up, that it really sort of came to bear, that things really just started to, and the exodus was pretty immediate, right? That people just sort of left in droves. And so it was shortly thereafter that everything happened. So I was even back in the mainland when Stanford got in some legal trouble, for those of you who haven't read the book yet. And I know in the book, it seems like everything is crashing as I'm doing it, but it was actually sort of the height of the influence of the EDC program, right? It's certainly the case that that sphere of influence has not been repeated since that moment. So it begins in 2001, coming out of the Industrial Development Commission. So things like watchmaking was a huge deal in the sort of in the earlier industrial moment. And so in 2001, we shift away from heavy industry to what I talked about, this kind of virtual or neoliberal development. And so from 2001 till about 2007, it's going gangbusters. Like there's a lot of money to be had, there's sort of capital flowing, people are in and out. And it's really in 2008 when it all sort of begins to crumble pretty quickly. I hope I answered, I wrote those questions down. Did I miss one?
No, you have both of them. There's a really loud lawnmower here, so I don't
I don't hear it.
Okay. But that was so wonderful. Thank you. And I think it will be really helpful for graduate students and anyone going back to the field, even if you're not doing ethnography, just thinking about that kind of careful self-reflexivity and thinking about your positionality if you're going to work in archives or with informants. It's so crucial, and you model it so well in the book. I have so many other questions, but I also want to ask maybe Nestor to come back in, and if there are questions coming in from the audience, we'd love to have your questions. You can throw out some of those. I'll just ask one more while I still can.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could talk through, you mentioned briefly in your comment about spectral time, the complexity of the USVI, and that there's not only a kind of racial complexity or racial capitalism that's different in the US Virgin Islands, but even between islands, that there are certain kinds of inequities or differences. You mentioned pigmentocracy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you navigated the USVI as a kind of rich and complex space in itself.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That I greatly appreciate that, because I think of that as one of the sort of gifts of sort of deep thinking, long thinking ethnographic work over time. As I was saying before we began this formal event, so often, the USVI is sort of lumped together as an unincorporated territory of the US, a sort of exemplar of US empire along the lines of Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, right? That was sort of all lumped together onto this kind of awkward geopolitical positioning, which is true. And yet there's also really deep and wide material differences, not only across these spaces, thinking about Puerto Rico in relation to the VI, but between these three islands themselves. So St. Croix being by far the largest and most economically distressed of the islands, that's the reason that I was led to do the majority of the field work for this project there. And because that, to me, and to many people I spoke with, was where the stakes were the highest. So for those who are not familiar, St. Thomas is really sort of high on, if you've ever gone on a cruise, you probably went through Charlotte Amalie, right? On almost every cruise ship itinerary that circuits through the Caribbean, St. Thomas is a stop. And that has a lot to do with the sort of regulatory and legislative structure. So the seat of government in the USVI is in St. Thomas. So a lot of the decision making and the sort of power is centralized in St. Thomas, leading to often a lot of sort of bad feelings on the part of Cruisians who feel marginalized or sidelined. I've written about this in relation to the 2017 hurricane season after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, thinking about the way things like resources were distributed, right? Brownouts and blackouts, the ways in which people had access to stable electricity in the sort of terrible weeks and months that followed those Category 5 storms. So all that to say is that St. Thomas has been generally economically better off just because of its presence and its greater facility in the sort of global tourist market. Now we could talk about that, right? What does it mean? What kind of jobs are people getting? And what does that mean in terms of gender and race and sort of the ability to live an improved financial life? But that nevertheless, they are sort of more present, and there's much more in the way of handicrafts, hotels, tour operators, taxi drivers. They're just more of that. The scale is quite different than it is on St. Croix. And St. John operates differently. It's very small. It's only 8 square miles, and it's really a luxury kind of tourist market. 2/3 of that island is a US national park, which is, I have colleagues, Hadia Sewer and Crystal Fort Wrangler have written on this, thinking about the centrality of US empire and the way that it's a national park, so you're not able to access it in particular ways. So things that are called poaching or illegal fishing have long been sort of traditional lifeways for ancestral St. Johnians, and so now that's a federal crime. So St. John has its own sort of particularities, but all that to say, the parts of that island that are not federally protected are prohibitively expensive. Formerly owned by the Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller built one of his sort of founding resorts there, Kinneil Bay, which was decimated by the hurricanes in 2017. And so these islands operate, and sort of life on these islands are incredibly, incredibly different. And that, I think, is why we have to have these sort of finely painted portraits, which is what I try to do in this book, of saying this is what life is like here on this particular space. And I try to cast it out a bit wider, but I do want to sort of argue for the particularity of an American colony where English is the primary language, and what it means to welcome people from the mainland there, building on this history, and at the same time denying it, right? Saying that this is a brand new thing, we're trying something radically different, it's going to be great for everyone, when it's predicated exactly on the kinds of not only historical hierarchies, but contemporary geopolitical inequities that come with being a colony today. So yeah, there's a lot, and it's hard when people come to the Virgin Islands. Sometimes they sort of will hop around and think it's going to be one thing, and so when these sort of flashpoints of tension arise, which I write about in the book, it's very surprising to visitors sometimes. Like, why are Cruisians so wary of Saint-Thomians? Like, what is this competition about? I mean, a lot of it really comes down to economic competition. And feelings of being overlooked with the way that power is laid out across these islands.
Thank you so much for explaining that and giving us some more nuance. There are 2 questions coming in on the chat. I think one can help illuminate the other a bit. So one is about the EDC.
Okay.
Patsy Lewis has a question about if you can explain what the EDC is. And again, I apologize if you can hear some ambient noise. There's a lawnmower outside. And then the second question is from Elisa Trotz, and it's two questions. The first is, financial services were being sold on the island and in the region as having what you describe as, quote, less of an environmental impact. This has a particular resonance in St. Croix, where oil refining has left a huge and disastrous footprint with the refinery declaring bankruptcy.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to this and to the entanglements between finance capital and extractivism that belie this easy binary.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're ready for the second one.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the third, I think. That's three.
Three, yes, sorry. Lisa's questions. How do discourses of outsiders and non-belongers shift between American investors and other Caribbean migrants on the island? Are those Caribbean migrants part of these EDCs in any way? For instance, as auxiliary labor forces, not in the front-facing air-conditioned offices, but as domestics, gardeners, cleaners, etc. Relating to this one supposes is an underlying question: how do Crucians themselves and their identities see themselves rather and their identity in relation to the Caribbean?
This is great. So many questions. I'm going to rely on you, Shauna, if I lose my way, if I sort of start staring blankly. I'm like, remind me three again. But I think I took good notes. Yes, the first question, which my apologies should have been up front and center. What is the EDC? Absolutely. The EDC, the Economic Development Commission, is a financial services program that began in the early 2000s, 2001, as I said, that encouraged investment companies operating generally in the Northeast of the US mainland to relocate their operations to the United States Virgin Islands. And so the arrangement was that you would come down from New York or Philadelphia or wherever and really do the centralized operations of your financial management dealings in the Virgin Islands. And in exchange for that, what would you get? You would get up to 90%. It's a tax holiday program, so you get up to 90% forgiveness on your U.S. Income taxes. There are all kinds of sweetheart deals around things like property taxes and space, right? So that they had access to all kinds of land opportunities, which were not otherwise available to Crucians or folks in the Virgin Islands. And so in exchange for that, so they're getting all of this revenue, right? What are they supposed to be doing? Well, they're supposed to be hiring local workers. And sort of generally infuse, I mean, the real thinking is just infusing cash and revenue into the territory, right? So thinking is that all this money comes in, all boats will rise. We're not surprised that this doesn't happen, right? And so this is what I talk about, the misapprehension. Like, we don't get it. We held up our part of the deal. We have come in, we're spending money in these restaurants, we're holidaying. We have, as you talked about, some of the support positions, we have gardeners, we have, housekeepers. What is the problem here? But just thinking about some of the ways in which the reception that they anticipated did not match what they received. So the EDC is this attempt to infuse desperately needed, I should say, cash into the territory, particularly on St. Croix, by welcoming these financiers. And so this project is really looking at what does it mean for life, for quotidian life, when they come, right? We have that the federal and local government of the Virgin Islands work together to invite these folks. I mean, it was a sort of very promoted, curated program in their tradition, I should say, of the kind of earlier industrialization by invitation, things like Operation Bootstrap, where they selected these middle-class Puerto Rican young men at that time to go and sort of lobby Washington. Like, there's as we see with export processing zones, it's competitive, right? That these spaces are often trying to undercut one another. So we can give you a cheaper rate. We can sort of give you greater regulatory flexibility. So it is in fact competitive. So I think it makes sense that there's some befuddlement on the part of these beneficiaries when they are not warmly received by these host communities. So I hope that does a fair job of answering what the program is. I should say too that my emphasis really is on the financial management companies. It's a much bigger program than that. Yes, thank you. It has operated for a long time. I talked about in the 60s and 70s in an earlier iteration. Instead of the EDC, it was the IDC, Industrialization Development Corporation. In that moment, which is sort of demonstrative of the larger development thinking in the region at that time, people were making things. So I talked about the watch manufacturing sector, which was huge, in the Virgin Islands. At one point in the 60s, up to 10% of all watch parts, when people used to wear wristwatches before the iPhone, up to 10% of all those watch parts were made in the Virgin Islands at the height of that industrialization program. Things like the sails that go on yachts, like that very particular canvas that's coated. So there were huge sort of hangars and warehouses were making yacht sails. So the industrialization moment sort of really goes away, and we move into this kind of neoliberal development. And so the EDC comes into formal sort of incorporation in 2001. And so that's what I'm looking at. But there's a much larger story to tell about development, what this program looks like outside of this very narrow, I should say too, that it's, it's a very narrow focus on financial development, but it had an outsized reception on St. Croix. So if you were to go to the Virgin Islands today and say, oh, I know about the EDC program, folks would not be thinking about the telephone company or these sort of yacht sales manufacturers. Exactly what would come to mind are these financial services companies, because of the kind of reception that they've received and the way they've, the people in particular have engaged with the local community. Yes, Alyssa's question about finance. I think I know what this is: finance, capital, and environmental damage. Yeah, so the idea was that exactly that they wouldn't need these huge hangars or sort of bays to make things and have toxic chemicals leach into the soil. This has always been a problem on St. Croix, which, as I say, is much larger than the other two Virgin Islands. It's 84 square miles to St. John's 8. So huge in comparison, much more arable, flat land, which is why it was the most lucrative of the three islands during enslaved labor, which I should say was operated by the Danish before it became the US Virgin Islands. It was the Danish West Indies. And so it was really the Danes, which people don't talk about within Caribbean studies enough, the presence of the sort of Nordic countries in the slave trade. So it was very lucrative as a space in an earlier moment. It has also meant that in this sort of the shift to industrialization, it had the space to kind of accommodate some of these more environmentally problematic industries, like Harvey Alumina. So it's a huge aluminum manufacturing really campus that has existed on the island for a long time, the remnants of which are still there, sort of hulking metal structures are still there. You drive by them if you're on the main kind of thoroughfare on the island. The other is an oil refinery plant, which has gone by various names, formerly owned by Leon Hess. So it was called Hess Oil, then became Hovenza in partnership with a Venezuelan outfit. Most recently, in the last decade, has become Lime Tree Oil Refinery, which has been abysmal in terms of public health and environmental damage on St. Croix. So most recently over the summer, there was a huge I think ongoing EPA investigation about some of the environmental damage. Just all kinds of toxic chemicals were spewing into the environment. Folks couldn't breathe. I mean, there was like thick fog of unknown materials, which the EPA continues to investigate. And Lime Tree claimed was smoke or something innocuous, but is not holding up to either public opinion or EPA analysis. So as a result of all that, they were heavily fined, declared bankruptcy, and it seemed like was on the brink of shutting down and being sold for parts until last week when it went up for sale. And so with the support of the local government, it was purchased by a mystery group of investors called St. Croix Energy, who wanted to not break it down and sell it for parts and remediate some of the environmental and public health damages, of which there are many class action lawsuits ongoing for things like claims of cancer, lung damage, asthma, you name it. But so St. Croix Energy, this mystery group of investors, bought it, not with the hope of dismantling it, no, but instead of restarting it. And it came out very recently that this group is headed by a major EDC beneficiary. And so he used the capital from this, the program isn't what it once was, but it still exists today. So the handful of EDC companies that exist on St. Croix, the head of one of the last few companies is the major shareholder behind this group that has purchased the refinery and intends to restart it in the fashion that it was operating over the summer. So all that to say that these lines, Alyssa, as you talk about these sort of easy divisions between finance, capitalism, and this sort of, even as I'm periodizing it, the sort of earlier moment of development, I think that this speaks to the kind of both the long history, but the kind of ways in which these things I'm thinking of Benitez Rojo here, are all interconnected, that there's a kind of repeating, and one can almost predict who will come out on top, and who will end up bearing the brunt of some of these development, which is really folks' lives, who will come out on top and who will not, right? And so when folks on St. Croix say things like slave days are over, they're pointing squarely to the ways that Black people, as Christina Sharp would say, continue to exist in the wake, the ways that they continue to be dispossessed, and the ways that they can almost predict that they will sort of end up on the bottom of these various development schemes. So I hope that answers your question, Alyssa. But yeah, that is an ongoing that's an ongoing space to be looked at. Are Caribbean migrants involved, and in what way? Yes, absolutely. And that is, that's tricky, because that speaks to the binary that I was talking about earlier when I said us and them, right? So us could be all Black people who are sort of in this undifferentiated, dispossessed mass against wealthy white people, which is a very easy narrative to tell, and holds some weight, but is not true. And there's a much sort of nuanced reality on St. Croix and in life, right? That I was talking about earlier before we began recording. It's not just Black people and white people on St. Croix, but there's a huge Puerto Rican community. There are historic French speaking communities known as the Frenchies on St. Thomas, a large and growing Arab community, historically significant Jewish communities. So one of the oldest synagogues in the Western Hemisphere is on St. Thomas. So there's a lot of complexity to life, and yet the narrative comes back of like, it's us against them, right? Which is sort of dispossessed Black people against wealthy white people. And what that does is sort of loses the space of these Caribbean migrants that the question is about, right? So in certain moments, they get sort of lumped together as us, as sort of Black people who are fighting against wealthy white capitalists. But in the next breath, Crucians and Virgin Islanders more generally, and this speaks to the second part of the question, how do Virgin Islanders see themselves in relation to the Caribbean? In the next breath, they'll say, well, we're not like those down islanders, right? So as I talk about Akia Gore writing about calling them Gassos or Garretts, like differentiating and saying that we Virgin Islanders are somehow better because of what? Because of the sort of status of Americanness, because of geographic proximity to the mainland. There's a whole host of, ways in which so-called down islanders or Caribbean migrants are culturally disparaged. And I write about this in the book. Shauna, you'll remember reading that, that folks, there's all kinds of name calling and taunting that goes on with folks being called down island, right? They're somehow not only economically disadvantaged, but somehow culturally, linguistically inferior, right? The sort of accent that people speak with are very marked and commented upon. So that is all to say that absolutely, that folks from other islands, Caribbean migrants, are clearly involved, right? There's all kinds of support services that they provide. Also, it's not to say that there aren't front-facing desk positions, air-conditioned positions that these folks would have, right? But the fact of it is that far and away, the people that do occupy those front-facing positions are Virgin Islanders with this very particular background, look, sort of history of mobility. And probably the last thing I want to say about that is that it all relies on a kind of division that doesn't hold up in reality, and I think we all understand this. This is predicated, this us and them is predicated on this notion that there are Caribbean migrants and there are Virgin Islanders, which is clearly not true in a place where migration has been the order of the day for centuries, right? So to say that these two groups of people are discrete is ridiculous and untrue. So many of the people I worked with, these EDC girls, their father was from Antigua, their mother was from St. Lucia, perhaps they themselves were born in Grenada, right, and came as a child to the Virgin Islands. So there's all kinds of complexity when we think about people and migratory patterns, that people are not static, right? That there are not these two groups that we can sort of chart separately, but that folks can have very complicated identifications. And so that is where it gets tricky when folks want to really, when there's this real investment on this binary of who we are because of this desire to determine belonging in the Virgin Islands. But the exclusions are really situational. You really see it in different moments, who the us is and who the them is. And I think that answers, I think that's 3. Did I miss one, Shauna? That's okay. Okay.
Got them all. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is such an enriching conversation, and it resonates a lot to my own work on the Puerto Rican context. I have a couple of questions about that, but first I would like to read two questions that we received. One is from Professor Rinaldo Walcott. He congratulates you for the publication of your book.
Thank you.
And he says, you mentioned in the Down Island people in your remarks. This is the second time I have heard you speak about this new work that I have not read as yet. The first time was earlier this week with Tamara Navarro. I am wondering if you might say something about the various different Black populations in the Virgin Islands and their claims to belonging. In one of your answers to Dr. Navarro, your description of some of the dynamics among Black people sounded similar to the ADOS discourse on the mainland USA in terms of who is the most authentic subject of the islands. Can you say more about these different historical moments of belonging as they relate to inclusion in finance, capital, labor?
Yes. Should I take that up, or do you want to read both, Nestor? I'm happy to take that up. That's plenty.
Yeah, let's start with that one. Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much for both the congratulatory words on the book and for coming to 2 events in 1 week. That is very generous. Yeah, this question is really the subject of chapter 5, which is called Putting Race to Work. And it is a complicated one because Ronaldo gets the prize. Absolutely, yes. It's a complicated one because it's dynamic, right? And so what will I say? That you will have heard me say, if you came earlier in the week, that there are these ongoing attempts to legally determine a space of belonging for Virgin Islanders through these events called constitutional conventions. The most recent of which was in 2008. It was the 5th constitutional convention, which was an attempt to really sort of create spaces of protection for Virgin Islands residents, either known as native or ancestral or some combination of these terms, native, ancestral, Virgin Islanders, around things like employment numbers, employment protections. So 10% of your employees must be native, ancestral, and land purchases is really the sort of impetus behind a lot of this. Thinking about, these are small spaces, as I say, St. John, 8 square miles, 2/3 of which is a national park. That leaves very little space. So wanting to say things like, as they have in Antigua, you must be native, ancestral in order to purchase land, otherwise you're able to lease it, these 100-year leases. We have these categories operating legally in the neighboring British Virgin Islands with belongers and non-belongers. That's just sort of background. What does that mean for Caribbean folks, Black folks from other islands? It really does echo some of the mainland discourse about who's the most authentic kind of what is authentic Blackness, right? But here in this context, for me, it's that there's no there, right? So that there's a reliance on this kind of linearity of time. So is there a particular date in which we can ground identity, which how could that make sense? But is there a particular date that we could say, when the sale of these islands happened, was your family present, right? Were you dispossessed enough at that time that you can now claim these benefits? Okay. Or is there a different question? Is there a different question around things like blood quantum laws, right? Can you demonstrate that you have this much African or whatever Virgin Islands ancestry means, right? All of these, I should say, were thrown into the pot of conversation during the really contentious constitutional conventions. And then there are things like what I talked about, the dynamism of identity. So folks saying, my dad's Puerto Rican, my mom is Antiguan, but this was one of the excerpts in the book where I say, this is the only home I've ever known, right? There's a sort of a TV host who's hosting a talk show who presents himself primarily as a Black Puerto Rican, but grown up on St. Croix, and says really adamantly, this is the only home I've ever known. I belong here, right? So there's a kind of deep investment in belonging to the Virgin Islands, which for me comes very clearly out of its non-sovereignty, out of its inability to determine really any kind of economic or political realities for itself, right? And so because the US empire exists and makes all of these decisions, there is a sort of emphasis on the cultural sovereignty, which results in this really deep and complicated ongoing debate about nativeness, which doesn't hold up. So that's all to say, Ronaldo, that there's not an answer that I can give you, right? That these Black people have been determined to be more Virgin Islands than the other. This is, if you go to the Virgin Islands, and I encourage you to do that, and you ask most people, what is a Virgin Islander or a native Virgin Islander? It's a really hot button issue. And so there's a firestorm of ongoing debate, which is actually the subject of my newer project, thinking about what does this word belonging mean, right? Because in one breath, it includes all of these people who have for generations been part of this Virgin Islands community. And in the next breath, there's a sort of seeking a real deep investment and searching for some kind of definitive proof that's really impossible to find, that you really belong here, that you're really invested in this space in a particular way. Blackness is, certainly, which is problematic for a lot of the people on these islands. Blackness is kind of the primary definitive category, which is problematic because many descendants of the plantocracy with Danish last names still object to this, and there was all kinds of debate around that. But be that as it may, the kind of question of Blackness and the competition around the most authentic, the most Virgin Islands Blackness is an ongoing open-ended question. And it's something that I'm looking at more deeply now in my ethnographic work, because I'm really curious about I know what the parts are, I know what the sort of investment in these various dates are, I know what the searching is for, but I just wonder, how do we get to a place under the auspices of this geopolitical positioning, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere, right? We're going to remain an unincorporated territory for the foreseeable future. What is this belonging about, and how are we going to figure out what, if we ever can, what it means? Yeah. That's a long way of saying, I don't know, but I don't know because nobody really knows. But even though we don't know, there's a deep desire to discover it and to somehow sort of unearth this key that unlocks this kind of cultural specificity of Virgin Islands-ness.
The second question is from a grad student, and this person says, as a PhD student studying the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean, I sometimes struggle in my discipline of politics to position the Caribbean as a serious side of inquiry that can inform our understanding of these global processes. Thank you for producing this work, which is a wonderful reminder that it is indeed okay to be a Caribbeanist. I wonder if this is something you have had to navigate and how you have moved through it.
Thank you for that. I think that I was spared a lot of that, and I absolutely appreciate the sentiment and understand clearly where that's coming from. I think I was spared a lot of that simply because of my training. I was trained by the incomparable Deborah Thomas I actually met her when I was an undergraduate student. And for those of you who know Deb's work, she is a Caribbeanist through and through, right? She is a proper anthropologist. And so my early ethnographic work was really with her in Jamaica. And so I was introduced to the work of Trio, Sidney Mintz. That was my introduction to anthropology. I came from St. Croix, began my undergraduate education, and met Deb Thomas, who for me was anthropology, right? And introduced me to not only the ethnographic significance of the Caribbean, but the theoretical significance of the region. And so it's through that lens that I approach everything. And so questions like, what is the role of a small, geographically perhaps insignificant space like the Virgin Islands in global financial transfers, is the first thing that would pop into my mind when I think of the EDC, because I think of the outsized impact of the Caribbean region and the outsized impact it has had since these kinds of circuits and circulations have begun during the transatlantic slave trade. So I understand very clearly the position, but for me, I think my training spared me some of that I took the Caribbean very seriously as a theoretical and ethnographic site because of the mentoring that I received. But I will say, however, that what I said earlier still holds, that it seemed to me that I should and would always do a project in the Caribbean, but it wasn't clear for a long time that it would be in the Virgin Islands, right? That question of one's home space was one that kind of dogged me for a long time, even in the writing of this book. So it seemed to me that perhaps I would go back to Jamaica, where I had done some of my earlier undergraduate ethnographic work. I mean, it took a long time, I think, for me to come to grips with the fact that this is the story that I had to tell, and these are the theories that I had to kind of take up, because this contribution to thinking about finance through the lens of anthropology needed to be told. And it seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, that I was the only person around doing it. So that kind of did away with some of the anxiety and insecurity of being from there. I just thought, well, this has to be told. People have to understand what's going on in this space if we're to have a fuller picture of the way that American empire is operating in the region today.
Well, speaking of empires, Tami,
Yes.
one of the things that struck me about your work is that you're describing processes that I see in Puerto Rico nowadays in a dramatic way, and sometimes is not taken into consideration the fact that Canada is behind one of the biggest failures of these neoliberal policies in Puerto Rico. I'm talking about the privatization of the electrical grid in the island that is under fire since this Canadian and American joint venture started administering it. This is something that has been causing a lot of debate in Puerto Rico. The widespread outages in the island since this company took over the electrical grid. This is something that I have noticed that is not mentioned in these debates about neoliberal policies in the Caribbean. Canada is becoming a more and more important actor in the implementation of those policies. I wonder if this kind of joint enterprises by American and Canadian companies are present in the Virgin Islands in the same way, producing these huge profits for companies and at the expense of the people in these islands that are basically ruined, literally ruined. It's not only the infrastructure of Puerto Rico that is in ruins, it's the people in ruins, fed up by the scarcity, the current situation that is unsustainable.
And the kind of just to add to that, the kind of exodus of the way that people feel no choice but to sort of flee their home, right? The sort of regular leaving of these spaces. The 2020 census data has recently come out, and since the last census taking in 2010, the population of the Virgin Islands has decreased by 18%, which is enormous, right? So people are not able to live their lives in these spaces, right? So it's a similar, I mean, I don't know the numbers for Puerto Rico, but I do know that anecdotally, like they're up there as well. People are leaving because of these blackouts and brownouts and this sort of inability to carve out a livable life for themselves. I'm answering that part of the question first because I don't know of any kind of joint ventures that involve both American and Canadian enterprises. The thing is, so often it's tricky to really know who's pulling the strings behind these enterprises. So I talked about St. Croix Energy, kind of only came out kind of first by a rumor and then circuitously that it was in fact this EDC beneficiary that was behind it. A lot of times these things are done by these various LLCs, and so they're, you know, board members that are variously positioned. So it would not at all surprise me if there was a sort of broader representation of North American power behind these attempts. I will say for the EDC in particular, because the benefits are so great for American companies to relocate to this American territory, the EDC has primarily been a US-based enterprise, but it would not at all surprise me to think about global capital more broadly and how these different, you know, national entities are benefiting from and sort of behind the scenes of these tax holiday programs. And I should just say, just on this point, Nestor, just comparing to Puerto Rico, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this moment, as so many of us have, of 2017 after the hurricanes and the rise of what you're talking about, this privatization, right, of these enterprises, this disaster capitalism, as has been theorized more recently. And I think, you know, it's the case that, back to Alyssa's question on the relationship between finance capital and environmental effects, you know, as the region continues to bear the brunt of things like climate change and we see unprecedented storms, that it's not that these spaces aren't discrete. It's not just environmental damage or damage to people's lifeways, but also then what happens, right? So with this sort of gutting of these examples of infrastructure, these private entities are more than happy to step in, right? As you're pointing us to, Nestor. And so the crisis moment created by something like climate change or environmental damage works in tandem, I think, or creates a space for the kinds of continued rise of neoliberal development, investment, and the kind of privatizing away from any kind of communally oriented infrastructure. So I just want to think through, like, this is not a story that ended in 2008, but as we continue to sort of go along, I think with the lime tree example, that's a great sort of moment to think about the ways that this continues, as you talked about, Shauna, shapeshift, right? How does it continue to pop up, and how are Virgin Islanders, Puerto Ricans, how are we attuned to these new forms of potential dispossession?
Shona, there is a question by Patsy Lewis. Could you read it for us?
Oh, it's on mute.
Sorry, it's reading a bit like a comment, yeah, which she just confirmed, but it's a useful comment. She writes, belonging also exists as a term of inclusion and exclusion in some Eastern Caribbean islands. The small size of these countries and territories generate understandable concerns around being disenfranchised, which I think she was adding a rejoinder to some of what you were saying, or a comment, so it's helpful. I would encourage folks, if you have questions, please don't hesitate, please don't be shy, please add them in the Q&A box here. I have another question, Tami, for you about the concept that I think is really, or the subjectivity that you kind of uncover through your ethnographic work of the EDC girl. And I was wondering if you could speak about what the EDC girl is, and maybe more generally, why you think gender plays such a key role, and specifically the work of Black women in these kind of neoliberal schemes for development, particularly in the USVI, but maybe even more generally, like the EDC girl and the role of gender.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was saying before we began recording to you, Shauna, that this is maybe my favorite chapter, the sort of easy money gender chapter. So who is the EDC girl? Generally speaking, she is a young woman in her early to mid 20s, sometimes 30s, that will have been educated at one of the local private high schools, does not have a detectable local accent, and comes from a background of relative privilege, right? So either middle class or upper middle class young women. And they found out about these opportunities in EDC companies, which often begin as internships. I should say began, it's not quite, the stakes aren't quite as high anymore, as internships over the summer or after school, and will then progress into full-time employment at some point. So if they complete college, or if they come home for summers, that it will at some point turn into a paid and well-paid employment opportunity. I came to be familiar with this program because when I completed my undergraduate degree in anthropology with no training or background in finance, a number of my friends and colleagues encouraged me to apply for an EDC job, a number of which I was offered without any discernible qualifications. And so I thought, oh, there's something interesting there when folks are looking for the right fit, the right face, the right candidate for this sector. Maybe there's something to these complaints that Crucians are lodging, saying that there's some discrimination, there are some hiring preferences here, which we need to look at. Again, complicating the we, right? When we say that this is good for everyone in the Virgin Islands, I'm looking at those hierarchies on which a program like this draws. So that's who some of the EDC girls are, and what are they supposed to do? Well, the thinking is that because they make more money than almost anyone else in the Virgin Islands, given the lucrative nature of this sector, many in the local community expect and encourage these young women to spend their salaries in really lavish ways, right? Really sort of ostensible ways. So like having luxury vehicles, taking regular vacations, very importantly, being seen at the right restaurants, right? Eating out a certain number of nights, shopping in this particular district of the island. So all of these interventions into the paychecks of these young women come from the thinking among much of the Crucian community that this money is not going to benefit the Virgin Islands more broadly, right? So the way to do that is problematically is through the paychecks of these young women. So that's kind of how they are and what they're expected to do with their money. I think that gender is important because one, this notion that their paychecks are a potential space of community intervention comes from this long history of feminist thinkers, folks like Cynthia Enloe, who have written about pin money and the presumed disposability of women's income, even against some of the Caribbeanist theories that we have, like the myth of the male breadwinner, such that for Black women in the Caribbean, this money has never been disposable, right? It has always been a source of necessary income to survive, both for themselves and their extended family and kin networks. So, you know, this position of this EDC girl is new, absolutely, in the Virgin Islands, but like much of this narrative, it draws on these longer histories, and we see similar demonstrations of this subjectivity in spaces like Barbados. So Carla Freeman has written on these, what she calls these pink collar workers who occupy different and important ways, but similar enough to mention here that, you know, they work in air-conditioned offices, they're doing data entry, that they're sort of positioned in a particular elevated way in relation to the broader community on Barbados, right? The sort of pink collar, the deeper investment in their fashion and their kind of presentation of themselves, I would say, is echoed by the position of the EDC girls. For Crucians, they would take it back even further. And I write about that, the sort of role, when we talk about the pigmentocracy and the role of things like shade or color, which again, I think is often gets short shrift because we sort of have this nexus of race, class, gender, right? But in the Caribbean in particular, shade or color is a hugely important factor of life, and thinking about a sort of axis of access to privilege. One of the things that Crucians will say is, well, it's not surprising that these women look like this, right? That they're lighter skinned young women with these particular last names. And I even write about, you know, it gets us fine grained. Gina Ulisse writes about this as hair texture, right? So curlier hair versus kinkier hair, that there's a sort of valorization of a proximity to European whiteness, right? That lighter skin, straighter hair is more desirable. And so Crucians will say things like, this is reminiscent of things like outdoor and indoor labor in the sugarcane fields, right? In the sugarcane fields right over there on St. Croix. So they will take it back even further and think about the ways that Black women have been positioned as appropriate employees or executors of particular forms of labor based on their race, based on their gender, but also based on things like shade. It's tied really closely to the kinds of work that they're seen as being best suited to perform. And that's not even to mention some of the ways that we see the consistency of this kind of ideology over this moment of factory work, right? That we see this over and over again, that there's a particular idealized kind of employee for a lot of these industries, and more often than not, it continues to be Black women. And so thinking through that ideology over time, and again, looking at the way that it continues to sort of reanimate itself in these different industries, but it doesn't change inherently, right? That it continues to be Black women whose labor is sort of marked in these particular ways. I think that is some of the work I try to do in historicizing the program, in trying to make legible this objection. Like, these people are not, it's not madness or misapprehension, but look at the ways this has played out over time. And then it becomes more legible, it becomes more clear why these objections have arisen.
Thank you so much. And I think that's why a racial capitalism analysis in your work works so well, because you're showing that it's not just about workers differentiated or alienated from capital or the means of production. It's also workers differentiated between themselves in some ways, women from women, these really interesting ways that are unique to the USVI. We have another question from Sidra Ahmed, who asks, have you noticed any significant way that these pink collar jobs have impacted family structures and or gender roles? Thanks, Sidra.
Thank you for that. I should say pink collar is not my theorization. That's Carla Freeman's in Barbados. And she writes, I won't say extensively, she writes quite a bit about family structure and the impact it has between I will say heterosexual romantic relationships. In my work, this is not something that was a huge, factor. I was looking at, one of the questions I have often gotten is, was there any kind of intimate relationship that was discernible between these EDC girls and their superiors, right? So these EDC men or the EDC managers, which I would say is not the case. And during fieldwork, I didn't see it radically changing their kind of romantic partnerships. I will say that their new reality as breadwinners of out-earning almost everyone, including their parents, I should say, or grandparents, with whom many of these young women still lived, or boyfriends, you know, if they had visiting unions or lived with them. It complicated decision-making, and it complicated daily life, in that having access to that amount of money, which generally speaking isn't that much, but contextually speaking, it's more than double what everybody else is making. Complicated things like authority and decision making in ways that I think people are actively negotiating all the time, both within their romantic relationships and more broadly within their family and community. Yeah. I'm seeing if I get distracted, I'm talking, I see all these chats pop up, and I'm wondering, like, do I need to respond to these? But you all are doing a wonderful job of curating for me, so I thank you.
Well, Tami, we're approaching the end of this event, but I don't want to finish without knowing a bit about your next project.
Okay, thank you for that. My next project is information. It's a question about belonging, and so the new project takes up these two moments of crisis. So I look at the 2017 hurricane season, and I look at this current moment of the COVID pandemic. And I try to think about what it means to be in the US Virgin Islands from this space of crisis. And is there a way in which existing in crisis, is there a way in which existing in crisis either privileges or detracts from Virgin Islanders' desire to be identified as American, right? So in the wake of the 2017 hurricanes, part of the reason that the population has dropped in this last decade by 18% is because people felt forced to leave, or their lives didn't feel survivable to them. In COVID, it has impacted life in different ways. So when many Caribbean islands were closing their borders or shutting their airports down, or you weren't able to come through by boat, the Virgin Islands was very proudly welcoming Americans by saying this is domestic tourism. And so because of that, the numbers of COVID cases rose pretty dramatically in the Virgin Islands, right? And so I'm trying to think through, what does it mean to stake a claim to belonging in the Virgin Islands when you may have to leave, or you may feel that it's necessary to leave. And so I'm just trying to think through what empire looks like in these spaces of disaster that continue to crop up.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tami and Shona, for moderating the presentation, and to all of our attendees.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Appreciated that.
We hope to see you in person in the near future to talk about that new project.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.